You thought I wouldn't understand it.
I'm beginning to think you understand it better than I do.
I am not just a Vulpine, nor a human. I am both.
Hey viewer! Support us on our Patreon to get your own custom stories and animations. And listen to us free on Spotify. Both links are below.
Saravi learned to read a room before she learned to read words. She was 4 years old the first time she understood, not in language, because she had none yet for a thing like this, but in the low, cold register of instinct, that the room she had just entered did not want her in it. Her mother's cousins had come to visit from the northern packs, 6 Vulpines with amber eyes and proud brushes of tail, and when Saravi toddled into the gathering room with her arms out for an embrace, the sent greeting that should have come, that warm, layered exchange of welcome, kin, safe, never arrived. Instead there was a silence with a smell to it. Sourness. Hesitation. The particular, unmistakable chill of people deciding, in real time, what she was. "She's lovely," one of the cousins said, in the voice adults use when they are performing kindness for other adults. "Look at those ears." Nobody touched her ears. Vulpine children had their ears touched constantly. By parents, by aunts, by packmates, 1,000 small affirmations of belonging threaded through casual contact. Saravi's rust-orange ears, so like a Vulpine's in shape and color, remained untouched that whole visit, as if they might come off in someone's hand and reveal a stranger underneath. She did not have the word for it then. She only knew that she went to bed early, and that her mother, Hilary, sat with her a long time afterward, running a hand along the length of Saravi's single tail, where a full Vulpine would have had 2, sometimes 3, each carrying its own thread of ancestry. And said nothing at all, because there was nothing yet to say that a 4-year-old could carry. School was, in its own way, worse, because school was where Saravi first learned that other children could smell exclusion coming the way she could, and chose, sometimes, to use that knowledge as a weapon rather than set it aside. There was a Vulpine boy in her cohort, Yaren, pack-proud and popular among the other Vulpine children, who had taken it upon himself, sometime around Saravi's 6th year, to organize a game the other children called Centag, a simple enough contest on its face, children scattering to hide their trail while the others tracked them by smell. The kind of game Vulpine children had played for generations to sharpen the exact senses their culture prized. Saravi had never been invited to play, not once, in 3 years of watching it from the edge of the courtyard. "It's not that we don't want you," Yaren told her once, with the particular careless honesty of a child repeating something he'd heard an adult say and not yet examined. "It's that your trail's weird. It doesn't smell like anything the game's supposed to be about. You'd break it." She had gone home that day and asked her mother, very quietly, whether her scent really was wrong, in some way she hadn't been told about, some flaw nobody had thought to mention because they assumed she already knew. Hilary had gone very still, the specific, dangerous stillness Saravi would only learn to recognize as anger many years later, once she understood her mother well enough to read past the practiced Vulpine composure. And then had knelt down, taken her daughter's face in both hands, and said, with a fierceness Saravi had never heard from her before, "Your scent is not wrong. Your scent is new. There is a difference between a thing that has never existed before and a thing that has failed to be something else. You are the first, little one. Never let anyone convince you that being first is the same as being broken." Saravi had believed her, mostly, in the particular way a 6-year-old believes a parent's fierce reassurance, with her whole heart, and also with a small stubborn doubt she couldn't quite dislodge, because Hilary could tell her she wasn't broken as many times as she liked, and it still hadn't gotten her invited to a single game of Centag. By the time she was 7, Saravi had built her own private taxonomy of the world's reactions to her. There was the human reaction, which came in 2 flavors. The first was delight, wide eyes, soft gasps, hands that wanted to touch her ears the way people touch things in gift shops, without asking, because delight excuses itself. Oh, she's beautiful. Oh my God, look at her eyes. Is that a real tail? Can I feel it? The second was unease, quieter, harder to name. Humans who looked at her too long and then looked away, who spoke to her parents about her as though she were not standing 3 feet away with excellent hearing. Then there was the Vulpine reaction, which was almost always some version of evaluation. A Vulpine meeting her for the first time did what Vulpines did with everyone: they scented her, read her, tried to place her in the vast internal map of kinship and belonging that structured their whole society. And they could not place her. Her scent was not the clean single-thread signature of a purebred Vulpine, layered with family and pack and place. It was something else. Something without a category. And Vulpines, she came to understand, did not trust what they could not categorize, however gently they tried to hide that distrust behind good manners. There was one memory from that early stretch of childhood that Seravi returned to more than any other, in the years that followed, whenever the world made her doubt herself most. The day Corin took her to the transit platform's observation deck to watch the twice-yearly convoy of settlement ships arrive from beyond the system, new families disembarking into a colony still working out what it wanted to become. She had been small enough to sit on his shoulders, ears unbound that day because it was a rare outing where no one they knew was likely to see her, and she had watched, wide-eyed, as ship after ship touched down, disgorging humans and Vulpines both, none of whom had ever met each other before that exact moment, all of them about to build an entire shared life out of nothing but proximity and effort. None of them know each other yet, Corin said, following her gaze. Look at them, sweetheart. Every single person down there is a stranger to every other person down there. And by next year, half of them will be neighbors, friends, married, raising children together. Nobody handed them that. They're going to build the whole thing from scratch, the same way this whole colony was built from scratch, the same way your mother and I built our whole life together out of 2 people who had absolutely no business falling in love according to anyone who came before us. So how do they know how? Seravi asked, small and serious, the question that would end up shaping the rest of her life without either of them fully realizing it yet. They don't, Corin said. Nobody ever knows how ahead of time. You just start, and you keep choosing it, every day, even on the days it's hard, especially on the days it's hard, and one day you look up and the thing you built is simply there, solid, real, yours, whether or not anyone ever told you the correct way to build it. He squeezed her small hand where it rested against his shoulder. That's the whole secret, if there is one. Nobody's handed a finished life. Everyone's building, all the time. You're not behind, sweetheart. You've just started earlier than most people ever have to. She did not fully understand it then. She would spend the next 25 years slowly, painfully, joyfully coming to understand it completely, one deliberate choice at a time, until the day she stood in a council hall and said almost exactly the same thing to an entire divided colony, in words she would only much later realize she'd first heard from her father's shoulders, watching strangers become a world. Her father, Corin, was human, an engineer who had come to the colony world of Orleans Station in the second wave of settlement, back when the alliance between the species was still new enough that everyone called it the Alliance instead of just the way things are. He had fallen in love with Hillary over 11 months of shared shifts repairing the station's aging atmospheric processors, and their marriage had been, by the standards of the time, a small miracle and a small scandal in roughly equal measure. You get to choose who you are, he told Seravi once, crouched down to her height in the greenhouse dome where he grew tomatoes as a hobby, his hands dark with soil. Nobody hands you an identity at birth, sweetheart. Not really. Not even purebred humans. You build it, piece by piece, out of what you do and who you love and what you decide matters. That part of you is entirely yours to make. Hillary disagreed, though not unkindly. Hillary disagreed the way water disagrees with a rock, patiently, and forever. Belonging is not a performance you earn, little one, she told Seravi that same week, brushing out her daughter's hair with slow, deliberate strokes, the two of them sitting cross-legged on the floor of Saravi's room in the particular silence Ilari used when she wanted a lesson to sink in rather than simply be heard. It is not a thing anyone has the right to withhold from you, and it is not a thing you must prove. You were born of two peoples. That is not half of nothing. That is the whole of something new, and no elder, no cousin, no stranger on the street has the authority to tell you otherwise, whatever they believe about scent and blood. Saravi loved them both, and believed them both, and did not yet understand that two people could be right about a thing and still leave her, their daughter, caught directly between them. One telling her she could choose her home, the other telling her no one could take her home away, and neither of them quite explaining what she was supposed to do on the Tuesday afternoons when it felt like she had no home at all. She learned to hide herself with the same patient thoroughness she brought to everything. Vulpine ears moved. That was simply a fact of Vulpine anatomy. The ears rotated, flattened, pricked, following the same instinctive vocabulary of emotion as a tail, or a voice. A Vulpine child's ears betrayed excitement, fear, embarrassment, interest, long before words caught up. Saravi's ears did the same thing, which meant that by the time she was 8 she had also, through hours of practice in front of a mirror in her room with the door locked, learned to still them. She practiced the way other children practice piano, grim, repetitive, until stillness became reflex. Her tail was harder. A tail has more surface area for feeling to leak out of, and Saravi's, though singular where a full Vulpine's would have branched, was exactly as expressive as any Vulpine tail. It wanted to curl when she was pleased, to go rigid when she was afraid, to droop, unmistakably, when she was sad. She could not still a tail the way she could still ears. So she learned instead to hide it. Layered skirts at first, then, as she got older, long coats and drape-cut clothing that a stranger's eye slid right past. By 14 she could walk through a crowded transit platform on Orleans Station and reveal nothing at all. No scent tell she could help, obviously, but no visible sign either, ears locked flat and neutral, tail bound close beneath fabric, face arranged into the careful blankness she'd practiced until it no longer felt like effort. Her senses were the cruelest thing to suppress, because they never stopped working. She could hear a conversation 2 rooms away if she let herself. She could smell fear on a person before they knew they were afraid. She could, if she wasn't careful, flinch at a scent of anger from across a crowded market before anyone had raised their voice. Ilari taught her the pack-disciplined Vulpine children were taught from birth. How to let sensation wash past without seizing it, how to keep the body still while the mind noted and released, and Saravi practiced it obsessively, not for the reasons Vulpine children practiced it, to hone their gifts, but for the opposite reason, to make herself smaller, quieter, easier to overlook. You should not have to do this, Ilari said once, watching her daughter fold herself down into that practiced stillness at a school function, ears flat, tail bound, eyes carefully unreadable. There was an ache in her mother's voice that Saravi, even at 10, could hear clearly. I know, Saravi said. But it's easier. It was not, in fact, easier. It was simply less painful in the specific, immediate way that mattered to a child who had already learned that visibility cost her something every single time. The particular cruelty of growing up as the proof of a policy was something Saravi did not have language for until she was nearly 16, sitting in the back of a public lecture hall while a visiting Alliance dignitary gestured at a projection of her own face, taken, without her permission, from a school record, and told an audience of settlers and administrators that hybrid children like Saravi represented the living evidence of what our two peoples can become together. She sat very still through the applause. Her ears, beneath the hood she'd worn that day specifically because she'd known, somehow, that this would happen, did not move at all. Afterward, a woman touched her shoulder in the corridor, a stranger, beaming, and said, You're so lucky, you know. Best of both worlds. Truly. Saravi thanked her, because that was the correct response, and went home, and sat on the floor of her room for a long time turning the phrase over. Best of both worlds. As though she were an argument someone else was making. As though her existence were a debate point rather than a life. She thought about all the things a person could be best of both worlds, best of both families, best of two ideas, and how none of those things asked what she wanted to be best at, or wanted to be at all. She did not tell her parents about the lecture hall, or the woman in the corridor, or the low, persistent ache of being celebrated as a symbol and overlooked as a person, over and over, in ways that were never quite cruel enough to name as cruelty, and never quite kind enough to actually feel good. She folded it in with all the other things she had learned to carry quietly, and she kept walking, ears still, tail hidden, waiting, though she would not have used this word yet, for a version of her life where she got to simply be, instead of forever having to prove that being was something she'd earned the right to. By the time Saravi turned 26, she had built a career out of the very thing that had once made her invisible. The ability to stand in a room and understand, simultaneously and without translation, exactly what a human was afraid of and exactly what a Vulpine considered sacred. She worked as a cultural liaison and dispute mediator on Kestrel's Reach, a mid-sized colony 3 transit hops from Orleans Station, where the human and Vulpine districts had grown up side by side for 2 generations without ever quite growing together. Officially, Kestrel's Reach was an alliance success story. Mixed councils, shared infrastructure, joined schools. Unofficially, everyone who lived there knew the districts remained 2 separate countries divided by a thin strip of shared streets, and that most disputes serious enough to require a mediator were really disputes about which country's rules applied. Saravi was good at her job. She was, in fact, extraordinary at it, and she had stopped being surprised by that a long time ago, because the qualities that made her extraordinary were the exact same qualities that had once made her lonely. She could sit across from a Vulpine elder furious about a human construction crew disturbing an ancestral scent marker and feel, in her own body, the violation he was describing, the way disturbing a scent marker was not unlike erasing a grave. She could sit across from the human foreman, baffled and defensive, and understand precisely why he genuinely hadn't realized the stone pile he'd cleared meant anything at all, because to human eyes it was only stone. She did not have to imagine either position. She had grown up fluent in both, the way some children grow up fluent in 2 languages before they can remember learning either. "You have a gift," her supervisor, Administrator Voss, told her during her 3rd-year review, sliding a commendation packet across the desk. "Kestrel's Reach hasn't had a mediator with your resolution rate in a decade." "Thank you," Saravi said, and meant it, and also felt. As she always felt, at moments exactly like this one, the small, familiar drop in her stomach as Voss continued. "It makes sense, doesn't it?" Voss said, not unkindly, in the tone of someone offering a compliment. "Given what you are. You've got both of them in your blood. It's not really a skill so much as, well, you were built for this." Saravi had heard some version of this sentence perhaps 400 times in her career. She had learned to receive it without visible reaction, the way she had once learned to still her ears in a room of cousins who wouldn't touch them. You were built for this. Not you worked for this. Not you spent your whole childhood learning to read rooms that didn't want you in them, and turned that survival skill into a profession, at a cost no one in this office has ever bothered to ask about. Just built. As though her competence were a factory setting rather than a scar she'd turned into a tool. "I appreciate the review," she said, and took the commendation packet, and did not correct him, because correcting him would have required explaining something she had never fully explained to anyone, and she was not going to start with Administrator Voss. The pattern held everywhere. When she brokered a water rights agreement between the 2 districts that ended a 3-year standoff, the district councils praised the unique hybrid perspective rather than the 11 consecutive nights she'd spent cross-referencing irrigation records until 2 in the morning. When she talked a young Vulpine man back from a confrontation that would have ended in violence, using nothing but a steady voice and an accurate read of his scent signature's rising panic, the incident report described it as her natural biological aptitude for de-escalation rather than the years of discipline she'd spent teaching her own nervous system not to seize on other people's fear. She began, slowly, to resent her own successes. Not because she disliked doing the work. She loved the work, loved the particular satisfaction of watching two entrenched positions find an unexpected door between them, but because every success was quietly filed away as evidence of her nature rather than her effort, and the distinction mattered more to her than she could easily explain to people who had never had to fight for the second word. Am I good at this because I chose to become good at it? She asked herself, more than once, walking home along the shared street that ran between the two districts, streetlights color shifting gently from the warm gold favored on the human side to the cooler blue favored on the Vulpine side. Or am I only a very effective tool that happens to have opinions? She did not have an answer. She had, at 26, an entire adult life built on a foundation she had never been permitted to question out loud, and a growing, quiet fear that if she ever stopped succeeding, if she ever needed help, or made a mistake, or simply had a bad week, nobody would extend her the grace they extended to anyone else, because nobody had ever really believed her accomplishments were hers to begin with. The case that best illustrated the shape of her working life came 8 months before Terran's arrival, when a dispute over a shared apiary threatened to escalate into something neither district could easily walk back from. A Vulpine beekeeping family, the Morisks, had tended the hives for 3 generations, treating the bees not merely as livestock but as a kind of kin, their honey used in morning rites, their hum considered a marker of a healthy bond between land and pack. A human agricultural cooperative, newly arrived with modern pollination contracts, had proposed relocating half the hives to boost crop yield on the human side of the district line, a plan that made perfect economic sense on paper and had, within a week, brought both communities to the edge of a genuine crisis. Saravi sat with the Morisks first, in their home, drinking the bitter dark tea Vulpine hospitality required a guest to finish before business could properly begin, and let old matriarch Morisk talk for nearly 2 hours about the exact particular hum of each hive, the specific place each one occupied in 70 years of family memory, before the matriarch ever got to the actual policy objection. They want the tallies, Matriarch Morisk said finally. Numbers. Yield. As if a hive is a number and not a name. She looked hard at Saravi. You understand that. You understand what it is to be flattened into a figure. I do, Saravi said, and meant it entirely. Then she sat with the cooperative's human representatives, a tired, overworked agronomist named Deshane who had inherited the pollination contract from a predecessor and genuinely had not understood, until Saravi explained it to him in terms he could actually absorb, that he was proposing to relocate what amounted to a family cemetery. Nobody told me that, Deshane said, visibly rattled. I thought they just liked the honey. It took Saravi 11 days, 24 meetings, and one very long night reading obscure agricultural regulation to find the door, a compromise in which the Morisks retained every hive in place, while the cooperative funded, at no cost to the family, a second, entirely new apiary a half-kilometer distant, staffed jointly, its future honey shared under a naming right the Morisks themselves would design. The Morisks got to keep their ancestors. The cooperative got its yield. And unexpectedly, the new joint apiary became, within 2 years, one of the few genuinely mixed community projects on all of Kestrel's reach, human and Vulpine children learning beekeeping side by side on Saturday mornings. Nobody wrote a commendation packet for that one. It simply worked, quietly, the way the best of her mediations always did, and Saravi had long since stopped expecting recognition to arrive in proportion to the difficulty of what she'd actually solved. It was in this state, competent, respected, and profoundly unseen, that she was assigned to work with a Vulpine historian named Terran, newly arrived from the northern packs, on documenting Kestrel's Reach's cultural heritage sites ahead of a contested infrastructure expansion. She did not expect him to change anything. She had stopped expecting that a long time ago. Her closest friend on Kestrel's Reach, and the only person besides her parents who had ever heard the full unfiltered version of how exhausting it was to be everyone's proof of something, was a human woman named Petra Okonkwoash, who ran the district's joint medical clinic and had known Saravi since her first month on the colony. You did it again, Petra said one evening, over the 2 glasses of wine that had become a standing Thursday ritual between them, in the small apartment Petra shared near the shared street. The water rights thing. I heard Voss practically wrote you a sonnet in the staff meeting. He called it a natural biological aptitude, Saravi said flatly, and Petra winced, because she'd heard this particular complaint enough times to recognize exactly the shape it was about to take. 11 nights of irrigation records, Petra. 11. And it's filed away as instinct. For what it's worth, Petra said, refilling both glasses. I've watched you work. It's not instinct. Instinct doesn't cross-reference 3 generations of water permits at 2 in the morning. That's just work, the unglamorous kind, and you don't get credit for it because unglamorous work doesn't fit the story people already want to tell about you. I know, Saravi said. I've known for years. It doesn't make it land any softer. No, Petra agreed. I don't imagine it does. She was quiet a moment, turning her glass. You know you're allowed to just be tired about it, sometimes. Not fix it, not reframe it, not find the useful lesson in it. Just be tired. It was, Saravi thought later, one of the few genuinely restful sentences anyone had ever offered her. Permission to simply be exhausted by something, without being expected to immediately transform that exhaustion into a lesson or a strength. She held on to it, quietly, the way she held on to very little else people said to her, and did not yet know how much she would need to remember it in the months ahead. Taryn arrived at the district archive office 9 minutes early on their first scheduled meeting, which Saravi noted and appreciated before she had even seen his face. Punctuality was not universal among the Northern Pack Vulpines she'd worked with, many of whom regarded strict scheduling as a distinctly human anxiety. He was tall, dark-furred at the ears and tailbase in the deep umber common to his pack line, dressed in the plain, well-kept robes of a records keeper rather than the more decorated formal wear some visiting officials favored. His 2 tails. Full-blooded, she noted automatically, the way she noted such things about everyone, an old reflex she'd never managed to unlearn, moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once in his life had to think about where his tails were or what they were saying. Mediator Saravi, he said, inclining his head with correct, slightly formal courtesy. I've read your case files. Kestrel's reach is fortunate. Historian Taryn. I've read yours as well. Your work on the Hollow Vale Scent Archives was elegant. She meant it. His methodology for preserving oral scent history in an era of encroaching human infrastructure was genuinely some of the best she'd encountered, careful, respectful, unwilling to flatten a living tradition into a museum exhibit. Something crossed his face, quick and hard to read. Surprise, maybe, that she'd read his academic work rather than only his file summary. You know the field, he said. I know the field. She agreed, and did not explain further, and watched him decide not to ask. Their early meetings were almost entirely professional and almost entirely tense, in the specific way of 2 people who respect each other's competence and distrust each other's premise. Taryn's task was to catalog and, where possible, protect Vulpine cultural sites threatened by the District Council's planned expansion of the shared transit corridor. Old scent markers, ancestral meeting grounds, a handful of sites with no equivalent in human record-keeping at all, since Vulpine heritage was carried in scent and memory rather than stone and text. Saravi's task was to mediate between his findings and the Council's construction timeline, which meant she spent most of her days being distrusted by both sides in slightly different ways. You cannot truly understand what's at stake here, Taryn told her, on their 4th meeting, standing over a faded scent marker near the district border that predated the human settlement by 2 centuries. His tone wasn't hostile, exactly. It was worse than hostile, it was certain. This is not simply a location to be logged and negotiated around. It is memory. It is who we are to each other, going back generations. You can read the file. You cannot read this. Saravi crouched beside the marker, closed her eyes, and let herself do the thing she almost never allowed herself to do in professional settings, because it cost her something every time she stopped suppressing. She let her senses open the way Illyrie had taught her, all the careful discipline inverted for once instead of applied, and she read the marker the way a full Vulpine would. Layers of scent laid down across generations, grief and welcome and warning threaded together into something that was, genuinely, a kind of language. Third generation founding line, she said quietly, eyes still closed. There's a mourning thread here, old, maybe 80 years. Someone died near this place, and it was marked so the pack would remember not to forget them, even after the scent of the mourning itself faded. Underneath that, older still, a welcome thread. This was a meeting place before it was anything else. People came here to be received. She opened her eyes and looked up at him. I can read this, historian. I have spent my entire life studying what you were simply given. Do not mistake my patience with your assumptions for an absence of understanding. Terence said nothing for a long moment. His ears, she noted, had gone very still, the specific stillness of a Vulpine recalculating something he'd assumed was settled. I did not know hybrids retained the full sensory range, he said finally, which was not an apology, but was, she understood, the closest thing to one he currently had available. Most people don't bother to find out, Saravi said, and stood, and did not offer him anything further, because she had already given him more than she usually gave strangers on the first real crack in their armor, and she wasn't yet sure he'd earned the rest. He came to earn it, over the following weeks, with a thoroughness that surprised her. Terran began bringing her, unasked, at first almost tentatively, to the harder sites, the ones his own survey notes admitted he did not fully understand, a fractured meeting ground on the district's eastern edge, its scent history so old and so layered it had confused 3 previous historians before him. He watched, silent and increasingly attentive, as Saravi knelt at its center and spent nearly 40 minutes simply listening, the way her mother had taught her, letting layer after layer surface without forcing any of it. There's a naming thread here beneath the mourning, she said finally, eyes still closed. Very old. This wasn't only a place people died, historian. It was a place they were first recognized. The earliest ceremonies before your pack's naming rights formalized into what they are today. I think this predates your official founding record by at least a generation. Terran checked his archive files against her reading 3 times that week, cross-referencing against fragments in the oldest records he had access to, before he finally found, buried in an appendix nobody had cited in decades, a passing reference that confirmed exactly what she'd described. You found in 40 minutes what my predecessors missed across 3 separate surveys, he said, when he brought her the confirmation, something unguarded in his voice for the first time since she'd met him. I have spent my entire career believing depth of understanding required depth of inheritance. I do not know what to do with the fact that you have either my bloodline nor my formal training, and you read this ground more truly than I ever have. You do the thing everyone does, Saravi said, not unkindly. You assume competence has to come from somewhere familiar to be trusted. I didn't inherit this. I built it sense by sense, discipline by discipline, out of necessity, because understanding both worlds was never optional for me the way it's always been optional for you. You could have gone your whole life fluent only in what you were handed. I never had that choice. No, Terran said slowly, watching her with an expression she couldn't yet name. She would only recognize it, months later, as the earliest shape of love, before either of them had a word ready for it. I am beginning to understand that you didn't. But he came back the next week having clearly spent time thinking, which she had not expected, and which she noted the way she noted everything, carefully, without letting herself hope too much about what it meant. I looked into your record, he said, without preamble, meeting her at the archive office door. Not your case files. You specifically. You've spent 9 years becoming fluent in traditions you did not inherit by right of blood, studying them with more discipline than most purebloods bring to traditions they were handed at birth and never had to earn. He paused. I misjudged you. I assumed inheritance was the same as understanding. I am beginning to think I had that precisely backward. Most people who inherit things without question rarely stop to ask what they actually mean, Saravi said. It came out sharper than she intended, not at him, exactly, but at every relative who'd ever declined to touch her ears, every elder who'd ever looked past her to the real Vulpines in a room. You could have grown up exactly as certain of your place as you are now and never once asked yourself why it belongs to you. I never had that luxury. I had to earn every inch of understanding I have, and I still get told it doesn't count because I wasn't born with it pre-installed. Terran's tales, she noticed, had gone very still, not the flat neutrality of concealment, which she recognized because she'd spent her whole life performing it, but the specific stillness of someone actually listening, really hearing something for the first time. You're angry, he said. Not an accusation. An observation. I'm tired, Saravi corrected. There's a difference, though I understand why they look similar from the outside. Teach me the difference, then, Terran said, and something in the request, plain, direct, without performance, cracked something open in her that had been sealed shut for a very long time. Over the following months, something shifted between them that neither of them named at first, because naming it felt dangerous. Saravi because naming things made them possible to lose, Terran because naming things had never before required him to examine himself quite this closely. They fell into a rhythm. He would bring her to sites the council hadn't yet scheduled for survey, and she would help him translate his findings into language the human administrators could actually act on without stripping the findings of their meaning. She would bring him into mediation sessions where a Vulpine party's position was being flattened into something the human side could dismiss, and he would supply the cultural context that turned unreasonable demand into coherent, defensible tradition in the space of a single well-placed sentence. They were, professionally, extraordinary together, and both of them noticed it, and neither of them said so directly for a long time. It was on a night survey, cataloging a scent marker network that only revealed its full layered history after dark, when the day's traffic scent had settled, that Terran told her the thing he had apparently never told anyone. They were sitting on a low stone wall at the edge of the site, the twin moons of Kestrel's Reach throwing pale light across the marker field, and Saravi had just finished walking him through a morning thread she'd found buried under 6 other layers, older than anything he'd catalogued in this sector. You said something to me, weeks ago, Terran said, watching the moonlight rather than her. That I had never had to earn my place. That I was simply handed it. I was angry. I shouldn't have. You were correct, he said, cutting her off gently. That is the difficult part. You were entirely correct, and I have been sitting with it since, and I find I do not like what I have found. He was quiet a moment. I have followed the traditional path since I was old enough to walk it. Historian's apprenticeship at 7. Full certification at 19. A post in the archive service by 22. Every step of it exactly as my father walked it, and his father before him. I know the old songs. I know the old scent grammars better than anyone in my cohort. I am, by every external measure, a Vulpine who knows who he is. But, Saravi said, when he didn't continue. But I have never once chosen any of it. Terran said, and his voice, for the first time since she'd known him, had lost its certainty. I inherited a path, and I walked it because it was there and because walking it was easier than asking whether I wanted to. You spent your whole life fighting for a place that should have been simply given to you, and being told, at every turn, that the fight itself proved you didn't belong. I was given a place I never fought for at all, and I have started to wonder, these past weeks, watching you, whether I have any idea who I would be if I'd ever had to choose it instead of merely receiving it. He looked at her then, finally, directly. You have spent your whole life being asked to prove you deserve what I was handed without question. I am beginning to think that makes you the more certain of the two of us, not the less. Saravi did not know what to say to that, so for a while she said nothing, and they sat together in the moonlight in a silence that felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely comfortable. I used to think identity was a thing you inherited, Terran said eventually. Memory, ancestry, scent passed down whole. I think I was wrong. I think it is closer to what you said weeks ago, though I didn't want to hear it then, it is something built deliberately out of choices. And I think, watching you, that a person who has had to build their whole identity out of deliberate choice understands it far better than a person who was only ever handed one and told to wear it. That's not what your traditions teach, Saravi said quietly. No, Terran agreed. It's what I've learned from you, in spite of them. Their romance, once it began in earnest, unfolded slowly and without the particular hunger Saravi had half expected from a man who'd spent his whole life certain of exactly what he wanted. Terran was deliberate with her in a way no one else had ever been. He never once asked her to be more Vulpine for his comfort, never suggested, not even obliquely, not even as a joke, that she soften her human edges or lean harder into her Vulpine ones. He learned, instead, the specific shape of her, the particular hybrid grammar of gesture and scent and silence that belonged to no one but Saravi, and he treated that grammar not as a compromise between two better things, but as its own complete language, worth learning entirely on its own terms. "Which half of me do you love?" she asked him once, only half joking, lying beside him in the pale gold light of the transit district's late evening, her tail unbound for once, for the first time with anyone outside her parents, curled loosely against his leg. Terran considered the question with the same careful seriousness he brought to a difficult scent archive, turning it over before he answered. "There are no halves," he said finally. "I don't love half of a Vulpine and half of a human stitched together at a seam. I love one woman, entire, whom both worlds help make, the way a river is not half of two different rains." "You are not a fraction of anything, Saravi. You are the whole equation solved." She laughed, because it was almost too much, too sincere, too exactly the thing she had spent her whole life aching to hear and never quite believing anyone would say. But she felt it land somewhere real in her chest, a small unclenching she hadn't known she was still holding. "That's a very tidy answer for a historian," she said, "to have somewhere to put the feeling." "I've had a great deal of practice being wrong about you," Terran said, and pulled her closer. "I intend to spend considerably longer being right." It was not, however, effortless, and Saravi would come to distrust any account of their courtship that suggested it had been. The trouble came 3 months in, on the evening Terran's father, a senior pack elder from the Northern Territories, visiting Kestrel's Reach for a heritage preservation summit, met Saravi for the first time. Elder Wesson was scrupulously polite in the way that costs a great deal of visible effort, and Saravi, who had spent 30 years reading exactly this kind of politeness, recognized within the first 5 minutes that he had already decided what she was before she'd said a single word. "My son tells me you've done remarkable work on the marker network," Elder Wesson said, over a dinner Terran had clearly hoped would go well and just as clearly could feel slipping sideways. "Unusual, for someone of your composition, to have such an affinity for the old scent grammars." "I studied them for 9 years," Saravi said evenly. "Affinity had very little to do with it." "Of course," Elder Wesson said, in a tone that suggested he did not, in fact, believe her, and the rest of the dinner proceeded with the particular strained courtesy of two people conducting an entire argument beneath a surface of perfectly correct sentences. Afterward, walking home, Saravi was quiet in a way Terran had learned by then to recognize as dangerous. "He didn't mean," Terran started. "Don't," Saravi said, sharper than she intended, and then, catching herself, softer. "Don't tell me what he meant. I've spent my whole life being told what people meant, as though the impact doesn't count if the intention was polite enough. He looked at me the way your cousins probably look at me. The way everyone in your world looks at me eventually, once the professional distance wears off. I need you to actually see that, Terran, instead of smoothing it over because he's your father, and it's easier." "I do see it," Terran said, and there was real hurt in his voice now, which surprised her. "I have spent months watching people do exactly what my father did tonight, and it has made me furious every single time, and I have said nothing, because I did not think it was my place to speak for an experience I haven't lived. I was trying to give you room to be angry on your own terms instead of deciding for you how angry you were allowed to be. Perhaps that was the wrong instinct. But do not mistake my silence tonight for indifference. I have never been indifferent to this. Not once since the marker field. Saravi stopped walking. In the low gold light of the transit street, she looked at him, really looked, the way she taught herself to read a room since she was 4 years old, except this time she wasn't bracing for the answer. I'm sorry, she said finally. That wasn't fair. I've spent so long being the only one who ever named it out loud that I forget, sometimes, that you're allowed to be angry about it too, in your own way, without it needing to look exactly like mine. We're going to get this wrong sometimes, Taryn said, closing the distance between them again. Both of us. I am unlearning 30 years of certainty I never questioned, and you are learning, for the first time, what it is to be with someone who will not simply take the easier position and call it peace. I would rather we get it wrong together, honestly, than get it right by pretending there's nothing here worth getting wrong. It was not the last disagreement of that particular shape. Elder Wesson remained cautiously unconvinced for the better part of a year, and Taryn's early instinct toward diplomatic silence took real, deliberate effort to unlearn. But it was the one that taught Saravi something she had not expected to need taught, that a partner who occasionally failed her honestly, and then stayed to repair it, was worth infinitely more than the polished, effortless devotion she'd half imagined love was supposed to look like. He asked her to marry him at the Eastern Meeting Ground, the site where he'd first begun to truly see her, nearly 2 years after that first tense conversation over a defaced send marker. He did not perform the traditional Vulpine binding request, the old formal words his father had used with his mother and his grandfather before that, a script Taryn had known by heart since childhood the way he knew every other inherited certainty of his life. He told her so himself, kneeling in the low evening light with the old naming thread she'd once uncovered still faintly perceptible in the ground beneath them. I thought for a long time about the correct words, he said. The binding rite my father used, and his father before him. I have decided not to use them. Not because I don't honor where they come from, I do, more than I once knew how to say. But because you taught me that a life built entirely from inheritance is a life someone else already lived first. I don't want to give you a proposal that was already spoken for. I want to give you one that's only ever been mine to give, the same way you've spent your whole life building an identity that was only ever yours. He took her hand. So here is what I have, in my own words, imperfect as they may be next to the old songs. I love the whole of you, built deliberately, choice by choice, exactly as you made yourself, and I would like to spend the rest of my life helping you build whatever comes next, not because tradition requires it of either of us, but because I have chosen it, freely, the way you taught me a life is supposed to be chosen. Will you marry me, Saravi? Not half of me to half of you. All of it together. Saravi did not answer immediately, because she was crying in the specific, unguarded way she had almost never allowed herself in front of another living person, tail curled tight against her leg, not from fear this time but from something closer to disbelief that a moment like this had actually arrived for her, after all the small careful griefs of her whole life. Yes, she said finally, and then, because it needed saying, yes, entirely. All of it. They were married 4 months later in a ceremony neither district had ever quite seen before, half the old Vulpine rites, half a small human garden wedding Corin had quietly dreamed of since Saravi was small, and a third element belonging to either tradition, invented for the occasion. A joint scent and vow exchange the two of them designed together, borrowing from both worlds and inventing where either sufficed, the very first small artifact of a hybrid culture that had not yet been given a name. The trouble began, as trouble on Kestrel's Reach usually did, as something small enough to dismiss. A human district warehouse fire, ruled accidental, that a handful of Vulpine residents insisted had been set deliberately over a construction dispute. A Vulpine scent marker, one Terran had personally catalogued, defaced overnight in a way that read to Vulpine eyes as an act of calculated desecration and to human eyes as unremarkable vandalism. A rumor, spreading fast through the human district's public boards, that Vulpine elders were petitioning to seize control of the shared transit corridor entirely. A counter-rumor, spreading just as fast through the Vulpine district, that the council intended to bulldoze the ancestral meeting grounds the moment the fire investigation closed. Saravi had mediated enough disputes to recognize the shape of an organic conflict, messy, contradictory, full of people talking past each other out of fear rather than malice. This did not have that shape. This had a shape too clean, too efficient, incidents landing with a rhythm that felt engineered rather than accidental, each one calibrated to inflame exactly the fear that would make the next one land harder. "Someone is building this," she told Administrator Voss, laying out the incident timeline across his desk display. "Look at the spacing. Look at the targets." Every one of these hits a nerve that was already sensitive, and every one lands with just enough plausible deniability that no single incident justifies real investigation. This isn't two communities drifting apart on their own. Someone, is pushing. Voss was not, in the end, particularly interested in her theory, which told her something on its own. You're seeing patterns because it's your job to see patterns, Saravi. Sometimes tension is just tension. She did not believe him, and neither, when she brought her timeline to Terran that evening in the archive office, did he. "Look at who benefits," Terran said, studying the display with the same patient attentiveness he brought to a 400-year-old Sen marker. "A fractured colony delays the transit expansion indefinitely. Delayed expansion means the current contractors, the ones already holding the infrastructure contracts, keep collecting maintenance fees on aging systems instead of losing the work to whoever wins the expansion bid. And a fractured colony means district councils stay small, insular, easy for a handful of entrenched voices to control, instead of merging into a single unified body that might vote half of them out of relevance." Saravi felt something settle into place, cold and clear, the particular sensation of a mediation case finally showing its true shape after weeks of noise. "You think this is coming from inside the councils? I think," Terran said slowly, "that we should find out precisely who benefits from both districts hating each other just enough to never quite unify, and not enough to ever quite resolve. I suspect the answer will be smaller and more familiar than either of us wants it to be." What followed was 3 weeks of the most demanding work of Saravi's career, and the first time in her professional life that her hybrid nature felt, unambiguously, like a gift rather than a debt she was constantly repaying. She used her Vulpine senses, trained, disciplined, honed by a lifetime of suppression she now finally got to unleash instead, to detect what a full human investigator would have missed entirely. A scent marker near the warehouse fire that had been artificially layered to mimic Vulpine anger signatures, planted rather than organic, its chemical signature subtly wrong in a way only someone who had spent years distinguishing real emotional scent trails from imitations would ever catch. She traced it, thread by thread, to a supply chain that led back to a synthetic scent lab licensed, officially, for theatrical and educational use. She used her human-trained investigative reasoning. Records requests, financial disclosures, the patient cross-referencing of paper trails that Vulpine culture, oriented around memory and scent rather than documentation, tended to overlook, to trace the lab's licensing fees back to a shell account, and the shell account back to a name that made both her and Terran go very still when they finally found it. Council member Ashvane Drell, a human administrator who sat on the Joint Infrastructure Committee and who had, for 6 years, quietly held a controlling stake in the very maintenance contracts that stood to lose everything the moment the transit expansion actually unified the districts. "He's not doing this alone," Terran said, studying the financial trail. "There's a second signature here. Someone forging Vulpine correspondence, feeding false rumors about the Elder's intentions into the human boards. That takes fluency either species has in the other's channels." He looked at her. "It takes someone who moves in both worlds." The realization landed between them at the same moment. Drell had a Vulpine partner in this, someone with exactly the kind of dual fluency that had made Saravi herself so valuable, and so suspect, her entire career. It took 4 more days of careful work, cross-referencing Scent Archive access logs against Drell's shell account activity, before they found him, a mid-level records clerk in the Vulpine District Administration, resentful and financially compromised, who had sold his own community's trust for a stake in Drell's maintenance contracts and a promise of protection once the districts fractured for good. "He used exactly what you're always accused of having," Terrence said quietly, when they finally laid the full conspiracy out, complete, undeniable. "Fluency in both worlds. Except he used it to burn the bridge instead of building it. And no one will ever question his right to have that fluency the way they've questioned yours, because no one thinks to suspect the ones who were simply given their place from birth." Saravi looked at the evidence, complete now, damning, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel at the end of it, not triumph, exactly. Something closer to vindication that tasted, unexpectedly, like grief. "For the first time in my life," she said quietly, "the thing about me everyone always called a liability is the exact thing that just saved this colony. And I don't know whether to be proud of that or furious that it took a conspiracy to prove it." "Both," Terrence said, taking her hand. "You're allowed both." The evidence, however, was not the end of it, because Drell's compromised records clerk, a Vulpine named Osik, cornered and desperate once he understood how close the trail had come, did not go quietly. He came to Saravi's office 2 nights before the scheduled council session, not through the front entrance but through the service corridor, and Petra, working late at the clinic next door, would later say she'd smelled his fear from the hallway before she ever heard him speak. "You don't understand what you're about to do," Osik said, and Saravi, who had faced down enough desperate men across a mediation table to recognize the specific danger of one who believed he had nothing left to lose, did not move from behind her desk, though every trained instinct in her body had gone taut and alert. "If this comes out clean, in open session, with both districts watching, Drell has people. People who don't care about council votes." "You think a fractured colony is dangerous now? Wait until it fractures because of you. Is that a threat, Osik, or a warning?" Saravi kept her voice level, reading his scent signature the way she'd read 1,000 escalating disputes before this one. The sour edge of panic beneath the anger, the particular unsteadiness of someone improvising rather than executing a plan. He was not, she understood in that moment, dangerous in the way he wanted to appear dangerous. He was cornered, and frightened, and trying to make his fear someone else's problem. "It's the truth," Osik said. "Take the deal Drell's lawyers are offering. Bury the second name. Let it end with him alone. You don't know what you're unraveling." "I know exactly what I'm unraveling," Saravi said. "I know you sold your own district's trust for a maintenance contract stake, and I know you're standing in my office at 11 at night hoping fear will do what evidence couldn't. It won't. I've spent my whole life being underestimated by people who assumed my composure meant I could be pushed. I'm telling you, once, calmly, it doesn't, and you can't." She did not raise her voice, and she did not reach for the emergency comm panel until well after Osik had gone. Not because she wasn't afraid, she would tell Terran later, but because she had learned, over 3 decades of being read as fragile by people who had no idea what she'd survived, that the worst thing she could do in that moment was let him see it land. Security escorted Osik from the building within the hour, and the full council session went forward, unaltered, 2 nights later, exactly as planned. "You should have called me the moment he arrived," Terrence said afterward, holding her rather more tightly than usual, his voice tight with a fear he was clearly working hard to keep out of it. "I know," Saravi said. "I will next time. But I needed him to see, in that exact moment, that I wasn't going to be moved. If I'd waited for backup, he'd have read the wait as weakness instead of caution." Sometimes the only way through a room like that is to stay exactly as still as it needs you to be afraid, and refuse. Terran was quiet a long moment, and then, very softly, "That is, I think, the single most Saravi sentence I have ever heard, and I both love you for it, and would very much prefer you never have cause to prove it again." The night before they finally confirmed Drell's name, the fracture Saravi had been tracking on paper became something she had to face in the flesh. A crowd had gathered at the transit corridor's midpoint, the exact strip of shared street where human gold-lit lamps gave way to Vulpine blue, drawn there by yet another rumor, this one claiming the council intended to announce the corridor's permanent closure that very night. It was false, planted, Saravi would later confirm, by the same synthetic scent apparatus Drell's lab had been producing for months. But a crowd does not stop to verify a rumor before its fear takes hold, and by the time Saravi and Terran arrived, alerted by Petra's frantic comm from the clinic 2 streets over, the two sides of the street had become, in the space of an hour, two opposing lines separated by perhaps 20 meters of increasingly hostile air. "This is exactly what he wants," Terran said quietly, scanning the crowd, his voice tight. "A public flashpoint. Something no amount of evidence can walk back afterward." Saravi did not answer. She was already moving, straight down the center of the empty strip between the two lines, into the open space no one else wanted to occupy, her heart hammering in a way her careful outward stillness gave no sign of at all. "Saravi," Terran started, moving to follow. "Stay at the edge," she said without turning. "Let them see one of us is calm before they see two." She stopped in the middle of the street, turned first to the human side, then to the Vulpine, and did the thing she had spent her entire life training herself to do without flinching. She opened her senses all the way, let the crowd's compounded fear and anger wash over her at full, unfiltered strength, and read it, layer by layer, the way she'd once read a single grieving scent marker on her fourth meeting with Terran. "There is no closure order," she said, pitching her voice to Carrie, flat and certain. "I have read tonight's council agenda myself. It does not exist. What you are all reacting to is a rumor manufactured within the last 6 hours by a source I will name publicly within 48 hours, in front of the full Joint Council, with evidence either side will be able to dispute." She turned slowly, meeting eyes on both sides of the line. "I understand the fear driving you here tonight. I have spent my whole life reading exactly this fear, on both sides of every line this colony has ever drawn. But I am asking you, as someone who has never once had the luxury of only understanding one side of a room, go home. Let the evidence do what shouting in the street cannot. I promise you will get your answers, and I promise they will be true, which is more than the rumor that brought you here can say. It did not resolve instantly, a colony's fear rarely does. But it cracked visibly, the tightly wound posture of the crowd loosening by degrees as person after person recognized her, recalled some old mediation she'd resolved for them or a cousin or a neighbor, and began, slowly, to disperse. By the time the street was fully empty, Terran's hand found hers, and neither of them said anything for a long moment, both still shaking faintly with the adrenaline neither had let the crowd see. "You walked into the middle of that alone," Terran said finally, his voice rough. "I walked into the middle of that as the one person both sides have spent years learning to trust, even when they didn't want to," Saravi said. "It had to be me. It couldn't have been anyone else, and it certainly couldn't have been two of us. That would have looked like a side being taken instead of a bridge being offered." She let out a breath, some of her own carefully held composure finally slipping now that it was safe to let it. "I was terrified the entire time." "I know," Terran said. "I could smell it, even from the edge. I have never been prouder of anyone in my life, and I would like to formally request that you never do that again without warning me first." "I'll take it under advisement," Saravi said, and let herself, finally, lean into him, the two of them standing alone in the quiet street where a colony had almost broken and, narrowly, had not. The council convened an emergency joint session the following week. Both districts' representatives crowded into the shared hall for the first time in over a year, tension thick enough that Saravi could smell it, real fear this time, not manufactured. The moment she walked through the doors with Terran at her side and the complete evidentiary record in hand. The exposure itself took less than 20 minutes. Councilmember Drell did not even attempt much of a defense once the financial trail was laid out beside the synthetic scent marker analysis and the records clerk's own compromised access logs. He simply went very pale and asked, quietly, to be permitted to contact legal counsel, which the council granted with the particular brisk coldness reserved for someone who has just been caught endangering an entire settlement for maintenance contract profits. But Saravi did not sit down once the exposure was finished. She had known, walking in that morning, that there was a second thing she needed to say, and that if she did not say it now, in front of both districts, in the one room where both of them were finally, actually listening to her, she might never get another moment exactly like it. "I want to say something that isn't part of the investigation," she said, and the hall, which had been ready to move on to procedural matters, went quiet again in a different way. "You've spent the last 20 minutes listening to how a hybrid's sensory range and a hybrid's investigative fluency uncovered a conspiracy that neither species could have caught alone. I expect that by this evening, most of you will be telling each other some version of the story Administrator Voss told me 3 years ago when I was doing my job well, that I was built for this. That my usefulness here is a function of my biology. I need you to understand why that story, however well-intentioned, is not a compliment. It is the same story that has followed me my entire life, and it has never once asked what I actually wanted, only what I was useful for." She looked out across the hall, human faces on one side, Vulpine faces on the other, the line between them thinner today than it had been in years, but still visibly, stubbornly there. A hybrid child is not a bridge built solely to serve the rest of you. We are not proof of anything you need proven, not evidence in an argument about whether your two peoples can coexist, not symbols to be paraded out at lectures and pointed at from podiums. We are people. We deserve the right to fail without it being read as evidence against our whole existence. We deserve the right to succeed without our success being explained away as biology instead of effort. We deserve homes we do not have to earn, and love we do not have to prove we're worthy of, and the plain, ordinary right to be unremarkable sometimes, the way any of you get to be unremarkable, without anyone treating our ordinariness as some kind of failure to live up to what we were supposedly for. Her voice did not shake, though she felt, distantly, that it had every right to. A child should not have to become extraordinary just to earn ordinary acceptance. That is not a burden either of your peoples would accept for your own children. I am asking you not to accept it for ours. The silence that followed was long enough that she began to wonder if she'd overreached. Then, from the human side of the hall, an older woman, a district elder Saravi recognized from a housing dispute 2 years prior, rose slowly to her feet, and after a moment, began to clap, and the sound spread, uneven at first and then not, across both sides of a room that had not agreed on very much at all and longer than anyone present could remember. Terran, watching from beside the evidence table, did not clap. He simply looked at her the way he had looked at her the night on the stone wall, moonlight on the scent markers, the first time he told her he'd been wrong about her. Except there was nothing left to be wrong about now. There was only her, entire, exactly as she was, finally being seen by an entire room at once the way he had learned to see her months ago, one careful conversation at a time. The transit corridor unified 8 months later, on schedule for the first time in the project's history, and with it came a joint council seat neither district had ever created before. A single administrative position representing the colony as a whole, rather than its two halves, a position both sides, in the raw, unusually candid aftermath of the Drell conspiracy, agreed should belong to someone neither community could accuse of favoring the other. Saravi did not campaign for it. She had, if anything, expected to be passed over. Old instincts dying hard, the quiet certainty that a hybrid could be useful in a crisis and still be considered unsuitable to actually lead once the crisis had passed. But the nomination came from both district councils within the same week, an unprecedented alignment that Administrator Voss, of all people, later admitted had surprised him more than anything else in his 30 years of service. "I want to be clear about something before you vote," Saravi told the Joint Council, on the day of her confirmation hearing, Terran seated in the gallery with his tails still in the particular way she'd come to recognize as quiet pride. "If you are electing me because you believe I represent some perfect midpoint between your two peoples, because you think a hybrid governor proves you've solved something, I would ask you to reconsider. I do not govern as half of each of you. I govern as myself, whole, shaped by both of you but reducible to either. If that is not the symbol you were hoping to elect, I understand. But it is the only leader I know how to be. The council confirmed her unanimously. She became, in the colonial records, Kestrel's Reach's first hybrid governor. Not, as the early press releases insisted on phrasing it, because she represented half of each population, a framing she personally struck from every official document she was permitted to edit, but because, as she put it in her inaugural address, a genuinely successful society did not require sameness as the price of belonging. It required only the willingness to let people be exactly what they were, without demanding they first prove it was acceptable. Terran remained at the colony's cultural archive, though his role expanded considerably over the following years, not merely preserving the old scent histories of the founding Vulpine packs, but documenting, with the same careful discipline he'd once brought only to inherited tradition, the beginning of something genuinely new. A hybrid culture, still young, still finding its own shape, made of neither species' old certainties but of something both of them had helped build together, deliberately, choice by choice, the way Seravi had always insisted identity was made. You were right, he told her once, years into their partnership, reviewing an archive entry documenting the colony's first hybrid naming ceremony. An entirely new tradition, invented from scratch by a handful of young hybrid families who'd finally been given room to invent something of their own instead of inheriting an ill-fitting old one. Identity is built. I spent my whole life certain it could only be inherited, and I was the poorer for the certainty. You weren't wrong about everything, Seravi said, leaning against his shoulder as they watched the ceremony unfold below the archive balcony. Small hybrid children with unbound tails running between the gathered families without a single adult telling them to hide anything at all. Memory matters. Ancestry matters. I never wanted to erase what either of us inherited. I only wanted the room to choose what to do with it. Room you had to fight for your entire life, that should have simply been given to you, Terrence said quietly. Maybe, Seravi allowed. But I think I understand it more deeply for the fighting. I wouldn't erase that either, even if I could. I'd only wish it hadn't been so lonely, for so long, before I found someone willing to fight beside me instead of asking me to prove I deserved the fight in the first place. He took her hand, the way he had the night the conspiracy was finally laid bare, and said nothing more, because there was nothing left that needed saying. Seravi was 31 when she found out she was pregnant, sitting in the small clinic on the colony's shared medical campus, deliberately built, at her insistence as governor, without a human wing or a Vulpine wing, just one wing, for everyone. With Terran's hand tight around hers and both of their tails, for once, entirely unbound and unhidden and openly, unmistakably happy. The worry arrived later, the way worry always did with her, not in the clinic, not in the first weeks of quiet joy, but on a still evening months afterward, the two of them lying together in the pale gold light of early evening, her hand resting on the gentle curve of her stomach. They'll ask what our child is, she said quietly, into the dark. The same way they asked about me. Best of both worlds. Proof of the alliance. A symbol before they're ever allowed to just be a person. I know what that costs, Terran. I lived every year of it. I don't know how to protect them from a version of the world I spent my whole life inside of. Terran was quiet for a long moment. Then he shifted, and rested his hand gently over hers, over the small, patient heartbeat beneath, and when he spoke his voice held none of the old inherited certainty he'd carried the day they met. Only the hard one, deliberate certainty of a man who had learned, slowly, choice by choice, exactly what he believed and why. Then we'll teach them what your parents taught you, he said. Both halves of it, your father's, that identity is something we get to build deliberately out of what we choose. And your mother's, that no one on this colony, no elder and no stranger and no dignitary with a projector and a lecture hall, has the right to withhold their belonging while they're still deciding what to build. He pressed his hand more firmly against her stomach, as though he could speak the words directly through to the small, waiting life beneath it. A child does not inherit half a place in the universe. They arrive deserving all of it. We'll simply have to keep reminding this colony of that, for as long as it takes them to stop needing reminding at all. Saravi did not answer right away. She lay in the quiet gold light instead, her husband's hand warm over the place where their child was slowly, patiently becoming real, and let herself feel, without suppressing a single thread of it, without folding it away for later the way she had once folded away every hard feeling that had nowhere safe to land. The whole, entire, undivided shape of finally, after 31 years, being home. Their daughter, Ilariwena, named for both grandmothers, Human and Vulpine, in a compromise Corin found deeply moving and Ilari pretended not to, was born on a quiet spring morning with a single tail, rust-orange ears identical to her mother's, and a set of lungs that announced her arrival to the entire medical wing without any assistance at all. She did not grow up isolated the way Saravi had. That had been, from the moment of the pregnancy, the one thing Saravi was quietly, fiercely determined to change, and being governor gave her tools her own parents had never had, a colony-wide curriculum revision that folded hybrid history into the standard Kestrel's Reach schooling. A public health mandate requiring the joint clinic to develop sensory integration therapy for hybrid children instead of leaving families to invent it alone in the dark, the way Ilari had. And more quietly, a standing invitation extended to every hybrid family on the colony to gather, once a month, in the same archive hall where Saravi's public address had once cracked a divided room open, not for policy, just for company, so that no hybrid child on Kestrel's Reach would ever again have to be the only one in the room. By the time Ilariwena was 6, there were 11 other hybrid children at that gathering, tails unbound, ears moving freely, comparing scent games with the same easy confidence Yaren's purebred cohort had once denied her mother. Saravi watched them from the edge of the hall one evening, Terran's arm around her shoulders, and felt something in her chest that had no single name. Grief, still, for the child she had been, folded in beside a fierce, unqualified joy for the child in front of her who would simply never have to learn what her mother had spent 30 years unlearning. She asked me today, Terran said quietly, watching their daughter argue, with great seriousness, about the correct way to layer a welcome thread with a boy twice her age. Whether she was more like you or more like me. What did you tell her? I told her what her mother once told me, Terran said. That there are no halves. Only one whole person, entire, whom both of us helped make, and that the making isn't finished yet, and won't be for a long time, because that's simply what a life is, a thing you keep building on purpose, for as long as you're lucky enough to have it. Saravi leaned into him, watching their daughter's tail curl in open, unhidden delight as the older boy conceded the argument, and thought, not for the first time, that some inheritances were worth building from scratch, so that the next generation would never have to learn, the hard way, that they'd been owed them all along.